Last time we were together, we didn't necessarily get off topic, but we did run into we bore down a little bit on a subset of judgment as we had some thoughts and questions as it related to the nature of modesty. There was an illustration of modesty that was given as it related to Annie and her brighter colors, right? And so then we talked through that, and I don't exactly remember how we got on that, but we started walking through the concepts of modesty and then judgment as it related to such things, the various areas where we would see liberty and the various areas where we may not see liberty. Now, as it relates to judgment on the level of us knowing what is right and wrong, saying what is right and wrong, that one is a little bit easier. We still have to deal with these four concepts of judging fearfully, judging humbly, judging lovingly, and judging truthfully. Even when we are saying something open, honest, clear, straightforward, down the line, even as we would deal with something very obvious, whether it relates to adultery or whether it relates to murder or whether it relates to those sorts of things, we still need to approach it in a context of saying, would I, right, with eyes wide open and clear-eyed in this situation, desire to be treated in this state in the same way that I am treating another, recognizing that we are not living in hypocrisy, having a hypocritical standard, recognizing that our intent is to understand and to help, not to impose, belittle, or shame, and then to be truthful, with an understanding that God is the only true judge, so we recognize that it's our job it may be our job to tell, but that God is the one who will truly judge, right? And that doesn't mean that God does not judge through earthly institutions. God has given governments the right to mete out justice for wrongs, right? God has given certain institutions the right, and we'll see as we continue through our series, God has given the church the institution of the church certain authority as well, that he has not necessarily given to individuals. So we think through all of these things, but then there are those areas, and one of those is kind of what we talked about last week, where there's a little bit more of a gray area, where there are things that are in our lives that, things in someone's life that you may disagree with, strongly disagree with. Be very earnest in your concerns about, and yet at the same time there may be a question mark as to whether or not it's wrong for everybody or it's okay for everybody to do certain things. And we talked about that a little bit with modesty, where there's certain things that we can be fairly cut and dry about as it relates to certain elements of both modesty and decency, as we talked about them last week. But then there's other things that, maybe not as clear as it relates to these things, where we have to have a little bit of subjectivity. Well, yes, if a certain person wore that, well, that might be immodest, right? Not indecent, but immodest, whereas someone else, that's them to a T. And so it's something that, as you might say, they can get away with or they can pull off. Someone else may not be able to pull that off without drawing undue attention to themselves. So I'd like to kind of walk through this in a little bit of a hypothetical way. And I was planning on doing cookies. We haven't had cookies for the last few weeks, so I've had a cookie in my bag ready to use a cookie example, because why not use the example of a cookie, right? Now, this is not the most exciting cookie ever. It's like an oatmeal cookie, and it has some sort of fruit something or other, and I don't normally like fruit in my cookies, and then it's drizzled with like a white fudge. But it's still quite delicious because it's a cookie. But let's talk about cookies for a minute. And this is just going to be kind of a hypothetical, an object lesson, and we'll think through this together. Now, let me get a little interaction. Is it okay to eat this cookie? No. Joel says yes. Nathaniel says no. Anyone else?
Of course.
Steve says of course.
It depends. What is it going to do to your blood sugar?
Okay. Well, is it going to do anything good to anyone's blood sugar?
No. Probably not.
Okay, so we have an argument to be made here. Now, I heard, I want to say it was Nathaniel a couple of weeks ago while Joel was eating a cookie, that thing's going to kill you, Now, I noticed, though, that Joel is still here. And he doesn't even necessarily look worse for the wear. So, what's it going to do to your blood sugar? What's it going to do to everyone's blood sugar, anyone's blood sugar? But are there mitigating factors to certain people at certain seasons of life, certain energy levels, certain whatever it might be as it relates to their blood sugar? Certain diets, whatever the case may be. And so, it's not necessarily clear-cut, should I eat this cookie? And even if it does slightly spike my blood sugar, does that inherently mean I should not or cannot or dare not eat this cookie? That it would be bad for me to eat this cookie? And so let's walk through all of the scenarios as it relates to this cookie. What are some reasons why a buddy should not eat this cookie? We already said spike in blood sugar. Why should someone not eat this cookie? Let's walk through it. Sam? Don't have enough to share. That's not what I expected in the negatives, but maybe, right? Maybe because I don't have enough to share, and that would be cruel and unusual punishment for everyone else. It does smell pretty good. Why else? Nathaniel, oh, yeah, Kimberly?
Are you someone, or is the person we're talking about eating this someone who can stop at just one, or is it a trigger point where they can't?
Okay, so how temperate am I? Do I have a cookie problem? And I do have a cookie problem, as you all know. If I start, will I be able to stop? That will be a question that each person in this room may have a different answer to. Can I start and stop? Can I be temperate? What's my blood sugar? What else? Sam, would you eat this cookie today? No. Sam would not eat this cookie today. We all know why Sam would not eat this cookie today. He would enjoy this cookie, and then he'd spend time saying, why did I eat that cookie? Nathaniel, would you eat this cookie? No. Allison, would you eat this cookie? No. Steve, would you eat this cookie? Sure. I mean, other than the fact that I've got my hands all over it. Sure. Right. So there are certain times and seasons where maybe in 6 months I ask Sam, would you eat this cookie? And he'll say, yeah, give me 2. But not today. And maybe not again, maybe in 6, we don't know, right? But not today. So, for somebody in this room, they can vehemently and very strongly set themselves against this cookie because this cookie would be bad for them or their family, or they've seen the results of somebody eating too many cookies, and they don't want that for themselves or their family, so they're going to, so they have cast off all cookies because they have seen what happened to someone who ate too many cookies. And we have these various elements of our lives. Now, let's go the other way around. Why is it okay to eat this cookie? Because it's delicious, okay. Okay. I mean, not generally a good reason. That's a perk. Let's call it that.
There's nothing explicit in the Bible that says thou shalt not eat that.
Okay, so there's nothing that, so meat's for the belly and the belly's for meat, right? This is food, debatably. And we would have a debate about how processed is it, can your body actually digest it, all of those things. But this is food intended to go into my stomach, be processed by my body. And since meat's for the belly and the belly's for meats, and the Bible has no prohibition against such things, I am not biblically prohibited from putting this into my body. Why else can I eat this cookie? Why else could I, depending on who I am? Andrea.
I was actually thinking what it can kind of go either way for the negatives, but like, does that particular cookie look appetizing to me?
Sure.
The preference then, you know, it's like, I have a hard time stopping eating cookies once I start, but I'd much rather have a chocolate chip cookie than that.
Right.
And in that case, that does not look appetizing, but I can still eat it if it was my preference.
Sure, certainly able to pass on one, or maybe I'm not going to eat the chocolate chip cookie because I know I can't stop, whereas this one would maybe scratch the itch, but it would not tempt me to continue down its path. Why else could I eat this cookie? Sam?
Well, kind of venturing into, theoretical, if we were in say a witnessing scenario and someone invited us into their home and
Yep.
lemonade, and they want to be hospitable to you, and you're sharing the gospel with them, and refusing all that might halt the progress that you're making, even though you maybe don't normally eat that cookie. You may say, hey, God's blessed it, I'm going to move forward with this because it could, in a sense, a testimony.
Good. So I may not normally eat cookies, but in a situation where I am in someone else's domain or whatever the case may be, and it might be offensive to reject the cookie for sake of testimony or whatever the case may be, and in that the cookie is not inherently wrong. Now, if it were inherently wrong, it would be a poor testimony to eat the cookie. But in that it's not inherently wrong, and in that this is an opportunity to not offend or to connect with someone else's culture or someone else's whatever it might be. Of course, we're metaphoring the cookie at this point, generally speaking. But maybe I'll eat the cookie in that scenario where I wouldn't normally eat the cookie. What else? Nathaniel.
If I'm in the desert or somewhere starving and that's the only thing to eat, well, I'll definitely eat it.
Right. I've got nothing else to eat but the cookie, and I'm going to starve if I don't.
By eating it, then not eating it.
Right. Sam, was there another?
Just to piggyback off that one, and I don't know if maybe a rabbit trail that's not worth going down at this point, but the scenario that I laid out, I know many missionaries that struggle one way or the other when it comes to alcohol in certain countries.
Right. Yeah, and that's the one that comes to my mind. I know when I was in France, when I was younger, one of the things that they did with us, we were at my mother's aunt and uncle's house, because my mom is French and her family is French. And so we had met them all for the first time, and they pulled out these cherries that were in a fermented wine of some sort, a fermented, grape juice, a wine of some sort. And I mean, they had been in that jar for 150 some odd years, passed down from generation to generation. They only pulled them out to honor their most honored guests. What do you do, right? In a situation such as that, especially in a situation, I mean, that's family, that's one thing. What do you do when you're a missionary? What do you do when you're a representative of Christ, when you're seeking to connect to a culture? And it's one thing to get, there's a lot to that, right? And you're right. There's a rabbit trail we may not go down in full, although we could. But we're not talking. I mean, this study is not about liberty, right? This study is about judgment. But one of the primary areas where we struggle in this area of judgment, it's not so much. It can get to the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. And when we struggle in that area, it's when we sit in our ivory tower and we look down upon the little people who are sinning and we ignore our own sin, right? And that's the area where we would struggle in the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. But say on any given day, among we who are at Legacy Baptist Church, the struggle is going to be far more with how we feel about eating this cookie and how we interact with each other as it relates to the cookie, right? The thing that we all recognize to one degree or another has a function or a purpose. It's not direct sin, but that we all have come to a different place in our lives based upon what we've learned, our experiences, our own convictions, and some of those being deep-seated. You know what's going to happen to you if you eat a lot of those cookies. You know what they put in those cookies. Can you really say that you're being a good steward over your body when you're eating those cookies, right? And all of those different things. But then we think through this. Is it okay to eat this cookie? Well, we find our young men here who are extremely busy, high metabolism. Their blood sugar is not going to spike. That stuff's going to be burned up as fast as they can eat it. If I had a very balanced meal, it's amazing. If you've ever looked at studies show what happens when, even if you eat a salad or something prior to eating a high carb meal or whatever it might be, the spikes in blood sugar and insulin are just dramatically different. So maybe I did prepare myself specifically to be able to have a cookie at the end of my meal, right? These sorts of things. And yet there is a temptation to take our experiences, our understanding, and this would be the lovingly one, rather than understand or help, come up and say, hey, have you ever thought about that cookie? Have you ever thought about what's in that cookie? Have you ever thought about what that cookie does to your body? To say, that thing's going to kill you. No offense, Nathaniel. Right? And, Nathaniel looked pretty tongue-in-cheek to me. But in a broader application, we hear those things not tongue-in-cheek, don't we? These are things that churches separate over. These are things that people lose friends over. These are things that families alienate each other over. The deep-seated convictions based upon applications of Christian liberty. And so we need to be careful in certain areas. And there are certain among us who absolutely cannot eat this cookie, that even outside of the metaphor, for you to eat this cookie, you could not do that in faith. You know where your body is right now. You know where your health is. You know what you're dealing with. And for you to eat this cookie would be to step outside of what is responsible. What is safe, maybe? What is responsible? What is healthy? What is right? Whether that be specifically because of one cookie or because you can't stop at one cookie or whatever it might be. But just because you're that way doesn't mean everyone is that way, right? And just because you can't eat that cookie responsibly doesn't mean someone else can't eat that cookie responsibly. Just because you can't handle the temptation of the cookie doesn't mean someone else can't handle the temptation of the cookie. Just because you look and you say, hey, there's all of these people who eat cookies and now they are unhealthy and they can't handle it, therefore you should not eat the cookie. And that person says, yes, I understand that there are those people over there that can't handle it and they're unhealthy, but do you see that I have handled it to this point? Am I at risk, perhaps, of someday becoming like that if I get out of temperance? Yes, that risk is possible, but that's not where I am. That's not what's happening. Therefore, I can eat the cookie. Yes, but you're taking a risk. Yes, but I'm not in sin. And this is this is different from I am in sin, but I'm controlling how far into sin I go. Right? And that's a different line too, where you might have this conversation with someone and they'll believe that they are in liberty because they've drawn a line. And if you don't believe, again, you may not believe that. You may say, no, I think you crossed the line of liberty a little while ago, and now you're not in liberty any longer. But if we don't have scriptural clarity on the matter, then we need to be very careful. And to the extent that we do so, we add that lovingly part where we are seeking to understand and help, where we sit someone down and say, can we do a Bible study about this thing? Let's walk through the Bible, let's go through the principles. And then again, if at the end of walking through the Bible and going through the principles, you two agree on all of the principles but disagree on its application, then you two can probably walk away saying, we both love the Lord, we both regard the scriptures, but we have a disagreement here. And there may be a time where that person has to come up to you and say, you know what, you were right, I couldn't handle that. Or there may be a time where you have to go up to them and say, you know what, you were right, you could handle that, and I have limited myself in an area that I could have enjoyed perhaps. Because I was afraid of something, and so and that's not, that fear is never a good thing, but do you know it's okay to have every right and even the body that could handle eating a cookie and still choose not to? And when someone comes up to you and says, well, why won't you just eat the cookie? Because I've chosen not to eat the cookie. And that's where the don't despise those that eat not come in, along with the let those that do not eat not judge those that do eat. And so maybe this would have been a little bit better when we hit Romans 14. But as we establish these principles, this is the mindset that we're seeking to establish here. We have two different avenues that we're going down. One is, how do we handle people that we know are in sin in a way that would be right before the Lord, knowing that the Lord will, whether in sin or in standard, he will meet unto us as we meet to others. He will judge us as we judge others. But then also this area of Christian liberty, where I may never, ever, ever want to touch a cookie, but that doesn't mean no Christian can touch a cookie. I may not be able to handle the cookie, but that doesn't mean another Christian can't handle the cookie. The cookie might be very harmful to me, but that doesn't mean it's harmful to everyone. It may even, in a broader sense, be harmful to everyone in the sense that, nobody needs processed sugars in their body, right? But, except for my wife, apparently. But, simultaneously, can the body handle it? Have there been plenty of people who have lived their entire lives eating cookies and who have lived long, healthy, prosperous lives? Yes. And so, maybe the cookie is not going to be the issue, the hill to die on, right? Other thoughts? Sam? What's that?
I'm still not going to eat that.
Nathaniel's still not going to eat the cookie, but is he going to eat me? Is he going to judge me when I eat the cookie? Sam?
So adding a twist, thinking about the biblical idea, or the idea of, well, was that cookie offered to an idol?
Yep. And that gets into the 1 Corinthians principle of meat offered to idols, right? And that comes back to the weaker brethren principle. And so we do add a layer of, has that cookie been offered or has it been dedicated to a false god? And Paul's answer to that is, of course, we know that they are nothing, right? That those idols are nothing. But to him, where it is something, it's something. And that's a real layer as well. Now, is there a danger in saying, because I've seen the cookie eating get abused, I will never touch a cookie, and those under me will never touch a cookie? What's the danger of such a mindset? Andrea? Yeah, those that, so I have a reason why I won't touch a cookie. And that reason is deep-seated in me. I saw my dad eat cookies and it led to his death, that sort of an idea. So that person is never going to touch a cookie, and that person has every reason in the world to never touch a cookie. Or if I eat that cookie, it's going to be the death of me. I can't handle that cookie. My body can't handle that cookie. That person has every reason in the world. But when that standard gets imposed upon others, whether that be a church or a family or whatever it might be, we need to be careful. And the reason why we need to be careful is because we can start to lose sight of what is actually right and wrong under a layer of the decisions that we have made. Now, that doesn't mean we can't make this decision for our church. We just have to, everyone that comes to our church has to understand why we've made this decision. And it's not because we think that everybody who hasn't made the decision is sinning. But and this is what we say at Legacy, right, with our standards. It's not, we don't do, everything that we don't do because we believe it's the only way, but we believe it is a good way. We might say, depending on the situation, we believe it is the superior way. And we have chosen this for ourselves. That doesn't mean we feel as though we have to choose it for everyone else. But this is what we've chosen. And we have every right to do that. And so when people come in here and they see what we've chosen and they say, oh, this is a legalistic church. They don't know that. They're determining that on the basis of the decision we've made, not on the basis of the reason why we've made them. And if the people in here, obviously our children are going to form their own convictions, but if we who are here have come to these convictions, then there's nothing wrong with that until we start to try to impose those on people who have not come to those convictions. It's nothing wrong with me choosing to never eat the cookie, as long as I don't go up to someone else and say, that means you cannot eat the cookie in good conscience. Steve?
You say you shouldn't impose those standards on people under you. Are you saying your kids?
No, I'm not. And this is where, so the question is, does that mean that you should not impose those standards upon your kids? No, as long as your children are a part of your family. But then the transition, two things. The first thing is we do need to make clear to our children that this is a decision that we have made. That this is not something that we have, this is not a thus saith the Lord, this is a thus saith your Father, right? And thus saith your Father is 100% valid in a family, right? It doesn't matter how arbitrary it is, as long as it's not sinful or abusive or whatever it might be, thus saith your Father is 100% valid. But we need to make sure that our children don't believe that thus saith your Father intrinsically means thus saith the Lord. We have a standard in our family. This is what we have chosen. Other people choose differently. This is why we have chosen this. These are our concerns. This is our experiences. We have seen people walk down that path and not come back. We have seen it this many times. We are concerned. That does not mean that a person cannot walk down that path and be right, but it does mean that they are in a place that we would consider to be danger. And then as they get older and they step out from under the umbrella of their parents, then yes, you need to stop judging. Then you don't judge Allison based upon your standards anymore when she's married, right? Now you can voice concerns. You know she knows, or you can re-articulate what she knows and what you've said and what you've taught. But you don't have the right spiritually to impose upon her your standards anymore because she's outside of that umbrella, right?
So how far do you bring the cookie example? So you were saying that it's fine to eat cookies, certain people can handle it, don't have health issues from it. So is it not sin until they start developing health issues, then it's sin? I'm just kind of wondering how far you bring that example, because, my wife's great grandma, she was a chain smoker her entire life. Died at 94, didn't have anything to do with smoking.
Yep.
She never had a single health issue from smoking.
Yep.
So is it fine to participate in some of those?
Okay, so let's talk about it. So the question is, at what point might something become sin? Is it only sin at which point your body reacts to it and you realize, is it only sin when you step on the scale and you've tipped just from 9.9 pounds to 10 pounds over your weight? When does something become sin? And this is a difficult one. And the example you gave is a great one, which is, Grandma was a chain smoker her entire life, and of course we know that back in the day cigarettes were very different than they are now, right? Nicotine levels, all of those different things. But let's throw that example out there in just a moment. But remember, our standard is whatsoever is not of faith is sin, right? At what point is there a problem with something, say, smoking? Now, smoking has been a fundamentalist deal for a long time, right? It's been one of those things. And all of the reasons surrounding why fundamentalism has been particularly hard against smoking have not all gone back to health. Testimony in some parts, the associations, the fact that where, when, and with who would you smoke? All of those things had to play into it. It's very similar to, if you recall, I went to Pensacola Christian College, and one of the things that we had, even a rule on the books when I was there in the 2000s, was no playing cards. that was based upon a battle that was fought in relation to gambling, right? And so playing cards became the casualty of a vehement pushback against gambling culture. Now, there's a lot of things you can do with playing cards that do not involve gambling. There's a lot of associations that with playing cards that go well beyond casinos. Can I pull out a deck of cards and play with them without anyone wondering whether I'm gambling? Probably. Maybe not 50 years ago. But certainly today. I can pull out a 52 card deck and the thing, it will not flash through anyone's mind, is Pastor Wikler gambling? Now, if there's chips on the table or whatnot, that might be a little different. But there's a lot of games that you can play with a 52 card deck, right? Now, so we think of something like smoking. What are our arguments as to why we would explicitly say smoking is sinful?
The first one would be it's a way to escape from a real problem.
Okay, and that would not be the first one that I would normally think of, but this is probably the primary one, especially as it would relate to the high levels of nicotine in them today, which is that people smoke as a means by which to deal with anxiety, stress, and such. Steve? They do. And this is where we need to check ourselves. People eat cookies for the exact same reason, stress eating, anxiety. People spend money for the exact same reason. People gamble for the exact same reason. People use illicit drugs. People drink for the exact same reasons that they smoke. Does that make it sinful? So is it sinful to use a material thing as a measure of physical coping? Or mental coping? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You know, Paul said, all things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful, but I will not be brought under the power of any, right? So he acknowledged that there is a line where I can do something, but then when that something gains power over me, then I'm in an area that, he doesn't even say it's sinful at that point. He simply says it's an area that I don't want to be in, where something has the power over me, where I have to, let's use some easy examples, where I can't wake up in the morning without caffeine. Now, it's one thing to drink caffeine. Late night, I need a little extra focus. I drink caffeinated coffee. I go out with someone to eat. I go out, have coffee with someone. Usually that's caffeinated coffee. I don't typically drink caffeinated coffee. You all know my story of Chuck. I don't normally do caffeine, but I do. I'm fine, you know. And I have caffeine, but maybe I will draw a line and say, I don't want to get to the point where I can't function without caffeine, where I get headaches and I get irritable. And that's the same thing that happens when someone's coming down off of cigarettes, perhaps, right? Nicotine addiction. They get irritable, they get twitchy, they get headaches. Does that inherently mean that these coping mechanisms are wrong? Well, no. We live in physical bodies. We are touched by the physical world, and there are things in life that are consolations. But we definitely don't want them to become crutches. And there may be a line there. Joel?
For a consolation in a Christian's life to replace their trust in God, which I've encountered with a situation. I would say that's definitely sin. We're having to have one of these areas replace God.
Yeah, to flee to a coping mechanism as a replacement for trusting in the Lord. Of course, it will never work in full. You have to keep dipping into that well again and again and again. And it progresses, right? If you start buying something every month in order to cope with your whatever it might be, and then eventually you're going to need to start buying more stuff, bigger stuff, whatever it might be, right? If you start smoking a certain number of cigarettes to cope, and then you end up doing packs and packs a day trying to cope, right? All you're doing is you're making the problem worse. And at some point, you have to say, not only am I dependent, but I am denying the Spirit. That is, however, different from, I've had a hard day. Today's a cookie day, right? Makes you feel a little better at the end of the day to eat a cookie. I feel better now. May not be, maybe getting down on your knees would be superior. I think of Jonathan when they were, after Jonathan's great victory against the garrison of the Philistines, and Saul says no eating, right? And so the men are struggling. And Jonathan takes a little honey, and he just feels so much better, right? And he says, my father performed folly in Israel this day because the men are weary and weak because they can't have food. Yes, I have consecrated myself to the Lord. I'm trusting the Lord. But maybe just a little bit of sugar would give me the energy I need to fulfill my endeavor, right? That's sort of an idea. Andrea, was that a hand?
I was actually going to say almost the exact same thing, but I was going to ask about it because that would be, you have to talk to the person to know whether they were at that point or not, right? Because each person would have to come to be honest with, has the Lord been drawing me to choose this instead?
Yep. Yep, this idea, and this is the same thing that I deal with in the jail with addictions, which is, one of the, when you talk about the 12 steps, you have to admit that you have a problem, right? Can I know whether or not a person that uses drugs is actually, so one of the things that I ask when a person says that they're a drug user, because there's a lot of people there in drugs, is, are you an addict? And some will say yes. They're at the point where they realize they're an addict. Some will say no, but they actually are. Others will say no, and it's actually true. There are some people that use because it feels good. A lot of times, those don't become addicts. The ones that are, the vast majority of addicts are the ones that are using because they're trying to cope. And they're trying to forget. They're trying to deal with something. Now, there are a few that actually develop, now, many of them develop physical addictions, but there are a few that are actually bound only to the feeling, that their body is just uniquely susceptible to the feeling of the drug. But the majority of them, that's not true. You deal with the problem that they're trying to cope with, and they hate the fact that they're using drugs, actually. But they have to use them to cope with their anxiety, their depression, their fears, their whatever it might be. Is it, if a person, and again, let's stretch ourselves a little bit here. I know we're getting into liberty more than judgment, but this is profitable. If a person is able to put a chemical into their body, feel good, and not be dependent upon it in the least, and move on past it. And we could talk about killing of brain cells and whatnot. We can talk about, but we can talk about that as it relates to drinking pop. We can talk, sugary drinks. We can talk about it with cookies. Any virtue can become a vice. We can talk about it with things that are positive, right? Can I throw myself into this ministry at the expense of my family because I'm trying to cope with something between me and my wife, and this ministry becomes sin to me? Absolutely. I am avoiding my wife by pouring myself into evangelism. And I just don't come home anymore because I don't want to have to deal with it. And so I just pour myself into evangelism, and anybody that questions me, I can say, are you saying that I should not be out soul winning? And in that case, the answer would be yes. You should not be out soul winning. You should be home making things right with your wife. But any virtue can become a vice. Now, there are certain ones that are more damaging, less damaging. But we do have to come face to face with the reality that some of these battles that we fought, it's not that they aren't there to be fought, especially when it comes to drugs and alcohol. I mean, that is on a different realm. Not to say that drugs, that there's no place. We've talked about that as it relates to alcohol and what the Bible says about it. But but they're dangerous, right? But so is the love of money, which drowns men in perdition and destruction, right? And so would we intervene with a man that is pouring himself into money making in the same way we'd intervene to a man that's pouring himself into alcohol? Or would we see those on two different tiers? We shouldn't. Because the love of money is in fact the root of all evil. Does not say alcohol is or drugs is, the love of money is. And yet churches have been far more lenient upon people who have pursued the love of money than they have upon people who have pursued drugs or alcohol. Now, that's not to say we should necessarily lessen our drugs and alcohol, but there might be actually a hypocritical judgment situation, wouldn't there? If we send a guy out of the church because he can't get his alcohol or he won't get his alcohol issues under control, maybe even as one who is functional. But we won't send that guy out who is neglecting his family so that he can make a ton of money, make a name for himself. Andrea? Lots to say here.
That's also a good reminder that some of the things might be completely hidden because they're not bad things necessarily.
Right. So you just said there are things that might be completely hidden. What do we do with that? And I agree with you in part, and I think this is where our church can be helpful in this, just the testimony of our church. Everything does bear fruit, though, doesn't it? And when relationships are right, it may be more obvious than we'd like to admit. We just don't want to see it. Because, and I can testify to this personally, if I see a problem, that causes a problem for me. Because now I have to emotionally invest in someone. I have to confront someone. I have to ask the hard questions. I might have to help them. I have to pour time into them. I have to invest in them. And that is, I guess, if I can talk about my own failings, I'd say there's a number of times where that's the reason why I choose not to see something. Is because if I'm the one that sees it, maybe I'm the one then that has to deal with it. And if I have to deal with it, that means I have to take the time, the effort, the emotions, the whatever it might be, the frustrations, the awkwardness, I have to be the one to do that. And that's where I have to be loving, to tell the truth. Sam, what did you have to say?
Well, just kind of piggybacking off of Joel's statement, and it was kind of, I've heard it used improperly at times, the idea of you're doing this, but you're not trusting God. When it may come to, I mean, I've even known people that had that with anything, a doctor's medical.
Yep.
Where,
Right.
You're taking this supplement or you're taking this, doctor prescribed drug, and you're not trusting God.
Yep.
And some of them believe it all the way to death.
Yep.
Is interesting, but just that comes down to what's this person's heart in the situation.
It does. So the idea there, and I'm reiterating a lot of what you say, first for the people in the back room and second for the camera, is the idea that somebody chooses a path, say for medical something. I'm going to get that surgery. Well, why don't you just trust God? You're not trusting God because you're having that medical procedure done. Or the other way around, right? Which is you've chosen to go a path, a homeopathic, holistic path or whatever, and I'm going to judge that decision. And we have a philosophy about that. One person says God has given us these doctors and these technologies as a blessing of our age. And there's things to be said for that argument because infant mortality is a whole lot less today than it was 150 years ago. There are, my wife and I were talking about this not too long ago. If it weren't for modern medical science, I'd be dead. Steve would be dead. Who else? Someone else in your family. Natalie would probably not be with us. Martha, Sarah's, we were talking about Martha. Martha had a hard pregnancy. Martha, Sarah's sister, would be dead. We'd have a lot of widows here if it weren't for modern medicine. Now, that's not to say that modern medicine can't get a God complex and get out of balance and whatnot, but we have to contend with that as we're also contending with the fact that there's a lot of things we can't trust in modern medicine because, and by the way, it's always been that way, right? Back when people were putting leeches on you when you had a fever, there were probably a lot of people that said common sense dictates this is not, this is the most recent science, but I would be willing to bet there were an awful lot of people who said common sense dictates those leeches aren't getting anywhere near me. And so people have always had to use common sense against science and modern medicine, while simultaneously recognizing that we have had a pretty amazing trajectory of technology, haven't we? And this comes down to, where's your heart? Can one person pursue a medical treatment in faith that another person says, I just can't do that, I believe that I would not be? Let's talk about insurance, right? I'm not a fan of insurance. Not just medical insurance, I'm just not a fan of insurance. I like the idea of trusting the Lord. I like the idea of leaving that in His hands. That is something that the Lord has laid on my heart. Am I ever going to stand behind this pulpit and preach against insurance? I'm not. Now, I have talked about insurance as an example of a place where we can allow the safety nets that are around us to overcome our trust in the Lord. But does that mean that there is never a scenario where a person has a situation where they can avail themselves to the insurance model that we find? Well, no. That doesn't mean that it's sinful, right? There's nothing sinful about it. It may be, though. And between me and you and you and you, maybe a couple of us can't get insurance without sinning. And a couple of us can, because what's in our hearts? And this is the judge lovingly with the intent to understand and help, not impose, belittle, or shame. Instead of going up to someone and saying, you do that, it's, hey, I noticed you do that. Can you talk me through that? Well, I've never really thought about it. Oh, okay. If you've never really thought about it, can I tell you what I think about that and why I've gone the way I've gone? This is a big one with decency, right? With the way women dress. Maybe a lot of them just haven't thought about it. Whether that's the fact that they don't know how men think, because women don't understand how men think. They just don't. Even after you tell them how men think, they can't relate to it. Or whether it's they don't understand how men think, or maybe they don't believe it. They've heard it, but they don't believe it. Or whether it's that they've simply never considered. In a culture where the very air you breathe are these things, maybe what someone needs is for someone to come up and with an attitude of understanding and help rather than belittling, shaming, whatnot. So to get back to what Steve was saying, though, to try to work our way back to this idea of something such as smoking, or whatever it might be. Nathaniel, did you want to go somewhere there?
Yeah.
Okay.
On the things such as smoking, I was raised under the impression that smoking was in and itself sin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it would have been better to reside on the things that are actually true and known, which is smoking is dangerous, addictive, those things that are undisputably objective, known, and to reiterate those things and say, based on the things that we actually know, this is what we choose.
Correct.
And this is why it could be sin. To reside on what is actually known seems to be very key.
This is how we handle this, right? How we handle this is this. Is smoking in and of itself sin? Wrong question. Right question is, what are the redeeming virtues and the negative elements of smoking? Smoking has a negative impact on your body. Statistically, that's irrefutable today, right? Even if a person makes it to 95 and doesn't even die of lung cancer, the the lung cancer risk is significantly higher, right, if you smoke. Now, that doesn't intrinsically make it wrong. I was talking with Steve the other day about, I did a radon test several years ago, and the radon test in my basement in the winter, so it was when nothing was moving, when radon was at its worst, was like one tick above what they say is safe. And so I did the research. What does that mean? And it means I went from 1 in 100,000 get lung cancer to 2 in 100,000 get lung cancer. And I said, okay, now am I technically imposing upon my family a danger by not dealing with that? Yes. But I'm not going to cripple my finances to go from 1 in 100,000 to 2 in 100,000. Right? I do much more dangerous things on a day-by-day basis than sit in my basement breathing that air. When I step into my vehicle, I've probably got a higher chance of having of getting into an accident by driving my vehicle than I do necessarily getting lung cancer from those odds. If it's within my power to deal with it, should I deal with it? Well, I mean, might as well. Might as well reduce risks. But can I say it is sin for me? But what can we say? We can say that smoking has negative health connotations, that smoking can become addictive and can become a crutch, that smoking, and this is a big one that we argue, and I think it's valid, is financially burdensome. People spend a lot of money on cigarettes. And that's a lot of money that could go in a lot of different directions. Now, once again, it's their money. We all spend money on a lot of dumb things. Maybe not all of us, but, if a person is spending $10 on lattes, are we going to get on them the same as $10 a week on lattes or $10 a week on cigarettes? Are we going to give those equal weight because neither one is necessary? Or are we going to, because one of them is so odious in our nostrils and mind, are we going to hold one above the other? So we have lots of reasons, lots of things that we could reason through to say this is not wise, this is not healthy, this is not profitable. But does that mean that every single person that engages in it must explicitly be in sin? Joel. Yep.
So liberty and judgment in a church setting are in the same sentence.
They are.
But that also jumped into what you're talking about now. A lot of times the people who are in or justifying the subject are the ones saying what's wrong with it, showing what's wrong in the Bible.
Correct.
And those who are admonishing a different path would be the ones saying, let's see what's right about it, or what are the positive aspects. Our goal as an elder are all, Jesus is all good. And our goal is in being like Christ-like, is to be more good, not to be more good than him, but to be more Christ-like, as getting better and better. A lot of times liberty users are what's wrong with it.
Correct.
And those others are, let's just take the better path.
So the point is well taken, that oftentimes when you're dealing with liberty users, the question becomes, well, what's wrong with it? When the right question to ask in the Lord should be, what is right with it, right? What is right about doing this? Is there any virtue? That's what Philippians 4:8 says, right? If there be any, whatsoever thing is pure, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are good, whatsoever things, if there be any praise, if there be any virtue, think on these things, right? So it's not just what's wrong with thinking this or saying this or doing this. It's what's right. Is there praise? Is there virtue? Is there edification? Paul says, let all things be done unto edification. Is there edification in it? Is there value in it? Is there virtue in it? And this is very true. But I also remind you of this. if a person is in a liberty place and he's asking what is wrong with it, you can divert to the question, ask what is right with it. But let me remind you of this as well. As it relates to all of these things, whether it be smoking, whether it be drinking, whether it be gluttony, whether it be all of these things, remember that these are, and we've talked about this, the fact that oftentimes these things are coping mechanisms, anxiety, fear, frustration, whatever it might be. If we're dealing with someone on them, we have to remember that what we're seeing, if there is a problem there, if there is sin there, then we're looking at symptoms, not the illness itself. A person is not overeating, generally speaking, as the problem itself. The overeating is a symptom, right? The manifestations of sin in a life are oftentimes symptoms of a deeper problem in the heart. And it is very rare that a person who is in a self-justification mode is going to be convinced by arguments against the symptom. You have to dig down to the illness. Now, that doesn't mean that if I get up here and I start pulpit pounding on some symptom, whether that's alcohol or whatever else, some person may not walk in who just needs to be yelled at. Because that does happen. There are times where I've gone to the jail and someone has said, I do this and that. And I remember several years ago, for those of you that, met, I won't name drop him, but several years ago there was a young man, and he was had gotten out of the army, had come home. His parents asked me to chat with him, had a testimony of salvation, was drinking heavily and playing video games, competitive video games, Call of Duty. And he was quite good. And so he would drink and he would play video games, and that's all he would do. And his parents were very concerned about him. So I sat him down at my house several years ago, and we talked through, and he admitted, yeah, I drink and I play video games and it's what I want to do. And I said, okay. And I asked him about his testimony of salvation, and he gave me his testimony, and the testimony was sound. As far as the words, right? He understood the gospel. He said it clearly. And the question that I asked him that just changed everything was, okay, you say you're a Christian, why aren't you living like one? And that was it. And after that, over the next several weeks, he calls me up, Pastor, I'm not drinking anymore, and I kind of feel like I shouldn't be playing these video games anymore. And within a year, he's on his way to college. He's getting a degree, which he just graduated from not too long ago. He's pointing his direction toward usefulness and testimony. And it kind of took a bit of confrontation. But that's someone who you confront him the first time and he says, yeah, that makes sense. But if you're confronting someone and there's a regular, well, what's wrong with it? Well, then it's time to go down to the actual illness layer. What's going on in your heart that you feel as though you should be doing this? That you're spending your time, your energy, your resources on these things that don't profit at all. Why is it that you always have to buy something new? Why is it that you're always eating? Why is it that you're chain smoking? Why is it that you're drinking? Well, what's wrong with it? No. I'm not talking about drinking. I'm talking about why you drink. Let's talk about why you drink. Well, it's fun. Really, that's it? I mean, the next day is fun? The morning after is fun? Well, no. Okay, then why are you doing it? Well, because I like it. Why? Right? And if a person if a person states that they actually do love the Lord and they care about what the Bible says and they're living in this place and you're concerned, well, then dig down to the thing that is actually producing the concern. Because that one they're not going to be able to wiggle away from. Well, in fact, you're bitter, you're resentful, you're fearful, you're anxious. Now, here's the thing. The Bible says, be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with things. Are you bearing the fruit of the Spirit? Well, no, not really. Okay, is there a relationship between the fact that you're not bearing the fruit of the Spirit and the alcohol? Is it the alcohol is not letting you bear the fruit of the Spirit, or is it you're not bearing the fruit of the Spirit because you're not bearing the fruit of the Spirit, you're using alcohol to replace what the fruit of the Spirit is supposed to do in your life? Now, the reason why whenever I talk about liberty, I call it a dangerous doctrine, is because as our children hear this, unfortunately, there might be one or two of them that is hearing license here, like Joel said. And this is why we talk about the heart. Because as we talk and as we understand and as we deal with people and we see the things in their lives that we would consider to be dangerous fruit, and again, we go through this process, judge humbly. So if I am a stress eater, I need to be careful the extent to which I levy judgment upon someone that's a stress smoker, or a stress drinker, or a stress buyer. Not to say that I can't acknowledge, right, that it's wrong, but I also need to acknowledge that I have an area in which I'm struggling also. I can't ignore my area and then I can levy judgment, but then it's going to be meted back to me. Because that's what the danger is there. So this is, a little dangerous. It's a little uncomfortable. But even if we think about Elijah after Mount Carmel, like we talked about in 1 Kings 19, where he's fleeing down to Horeb, and he's in kind of a bad way. That was not Elijah's finest moment. And that's why God dug to the root of the problem. God didn't say, Elijah, buck up, quit being afraid, you just had this great victory. He said, what are you doing here? And then Elijah sought to justify it, right? I've been very jealous for the Lord my God. And then he asks again, what are you doing here? And there was a bit of a contradiction between what Elijah said he was doing and what he was actually doing there. But God was gentle because he was struggling. And that's the idea here. Now, does that mean that I want my children around an alcoholic? Well, no, right? So there are decisions to be made where you say, look, if you're gonna to have these vices, these are things that I don't want my children to see as cool or normalize, and I don't want you around me if you're going to act this way. The idea there is not, I don't want you around me. That's what they're going to hear. But what you're saying is, don't do this around me and my children, right? But the irony is that if a person's heart is in the right place, they're already kind of there. Most of us know that Chuck vaped. Most of our children didn't. Because he was really careful about that. He had a struggle in his own life. But he was careful with how he dealt with that and how he expressed that as it related to those that were around him, particularly the young people in our congregation. Because he did not want someone looking up to him, respecting him, and then seeing his vice and saying, okay, I'm going to justify my own vice through his vice. And so if a person's honest with themselves, it doesn't mean that they're going to not have any vices, but it does mean that they're going to be honest, right, with themselves and with others. And so this is a very complicated thing. But as it comes back down to judgment, and we're a little late here, as it comes back down to judgment, though, this is why we need to be careful. It doesn't mean that we can't have standards. It doesn't mean we can't set them in place. It doesn't mean that we can't be dogmatic about them. It does not mean that we can't lead our children in that way. It does not mean it does not mean that we cannot speak strongly against something. I can speak very strongly against alcohol while acknowledging that the Bible is not 100% prohibitive. And I think that there's tremendously good reason to do that. And the fruit of alcohol in our culture and in individuals' lives bears out that that is wisdom. But I also need to, when push comes to shove, not stand over people with my judgments. I give advice, I give counsel, I impart wisdom, I give warnings, I do all of those things. But I stop short of imposing upon someone, censoring someone, simply because I'm not comfortable with the decisions they made. Joel?
There's those types of judgment is a problem on the judgment maker's side and the individual side. In a situation where someone like yourself is speaking against someone who has an issue of smoking, where the Bible doesn't explicitly say smoking's wrong, you could easily misjudge or like the severity of how you might say it could be inaccurate. But there's those other times where there is someone in the wrong, where you can speak in the same judgment way out of something that is definitely in the Bible, where you're not in the wrong at all. Speak severely against it.
Absolutely.
And there needs to be, we need to remember that we can't put, like we said, judging, we have so many different categories of it. Those who are in the wrong, we remember that just because you might not remember the Bible doesn't mean it's not.
Yep.
There's so much.
Yeah, and this is why the layers can be so interesting, because there are things that we need to speak about very strongly, right? And other things that we might speak too strongly of as it might relate to various elements of judgment. We're never going to get this entirely right, but also we don't want to be frozen into inaction either. And this is the other danger, right? We give all of these qualifications and all of these things. So from now on, you see anyone, you're like, well, should I? Shouldn't I? Tell them? Well, there's never a problem with reasoning out your positions with someone. That's not the judgment that Jesus is warning against. They may interpret it as that. That when I come up and I say, hey, have you ever thought about what you're wearing? Stop judging me. No. And this is why we need to be confident in this. Because if we're not confident in what the Bible says here, one of two things will happen when I go up and I say, hey, have you ever thought about what you're wearing? And they say, stop judging me. Or, hey, could you put more on? Stop judging me. One of two things is going to happen if I'm not confident in this. Either that is going to shut me down. Okay, I'm just not going to say anything. Or that is going to harden me. And I'm going to say, well, since everybody thinks I'm judging them, I'm just going to hit them hard. I'm going to hit them as hard as I can, and I'm just going to lay the hammer down. And both of those are wrong responses. Both of those are indicative of a person who is not confident in what the Word of God says about this. And because they're not confident, they just swing to one of the extremes. Because at least they're somewhere, right? And you're going to win some and you're going to lose some, but at least somebody needs to hear the extreme, and yep, I'm going to offend all these people, but then maybe I'll get someone. Or the other end of, well, I'm not going to say anything and just hope that they're in their liberty and they're not in sin. But if I'm confident in this, then when someone comes up and says, stop judging me, if you're confident about what you believe, and we've seen this in culture with other arguments now as it relates to cultural arguments, if you're confident in what you believe, then you can look at them and say, explain that to me. If they're the one that's charging me with judgment, then they get to justify their charge. All right, how am I judging you? Well, you're telling me that this is wrong when there's nothing in the Bible about it. What did I say? Did I tell you it was wrong? I asked you a question. What did I actually say? Am I concerned? I am concerned. Do I have the right to be concerned about you? Well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Well, I don't know that. You may not be doing something wrong, but you're doing something, and that something is not good for you. And it may not be sin, but it's not good for you, and I'm curious as to why you're doing it. Well, because I like it. Well, okay. Well, why? How's your relationship with the Lord? Are you then you dig down. But if you're confident, then you don't have to be. You don't have to step back and say, "Uh-oh, am I judging lest I be judged? Will I be meted?" No. You don't even have that conversation until you've run down this list. Fearfully, with what measure I meet, it will be measured unto me. Sowing and reaping principle. Humbly. Am I hypocritical in this? And that doesn't mean, am I struggling with a similar sin? It's, am I owning and acknowledging my sin and my area of struggle? Do I own it? Hey, brother, I noticed that you're struggling with lust. Doesn't mean I'm not struggling with lust. I don't have to wait until I'm not struggling with lust anymore to help a brother who's struggling with lust. I simply have to own the fact that I have struggles too. And then it's not hypocritical. And not, of course, pretend own it, right? Really own it. So, if I'm fearful, if I'm humble, if I'm loving, right? I want to understand where you're at here. I want to know where your heart is. Are you in a bad place, or are you okay here? Does this thing have control over you, or is it just something that you're doing? Is it discretionary income? Are you using discretionary income of this, or are your kids going hungry while you are spending your money on something else? Do your kids not have clothes while you're over here wasting your money? Right? That's different. That's different than a guy who has discretionary funds and is choosing to use it in a way, right, that he sees fit. That's not explicitly sinful, right? Is he coping in a way that is outside of faith? Is there any virtue in it? Even if none of those things, even if it's actually okay, right? He's not addicted, he's not coping, all of those things. Even if all of that is in place, the next question is the one that Joel asked. Hey, we've walked through all the reasons why it's not wrong. Is there anything right about it? You're spending this kind of money. Could I suggest that maybe you stop doing that and start putting your money into a fund so that when the next missionary comes through the church, that there's a fund, instead of buying a coffee every day, you'll get off the caffeine. That's probably good for you. Probably will make you, feel better. And on top of that, maybe put that money into a fund, and then when the missionary comes through, that $2.50 a day, $2.50 a day, $4 a day, whatever it is, becomes $500 in the missionary's pocket. And walk away just with suggestions, thoughts, things to try to make a brother better. Edification, right? I'm going to try to build you up a little bit today. But we get very defensive. When someone comes up and has a suggestion, that must mean we're doing something wrong. Criticism is not always about us doing something wrong. Criticism might simply be, you could be better. Sarah.
One thing I know that we've discussed with the children, again, it's not necessarily, it might not be you're doing something wrong, but it's how are people going to translate what you're doing? So like with smoking, it still has an association with morality.
Correct.
It still does. Playing cards don't really what smoking does, but it's what you're doing. Are people going to translate it as kind, good, self-control,
Right.
the fruit of the spirit, or are they going to translate it as harsh or judgmental or selfish? And that can go for both people, the judger and the one being judged, quote unquote.
Yep. Yeah, so we can add the testimony issue. Is there ever a time where you're going to be out, where we're going to have a pile of guys behind the church smoking, where that's going to be a good testimony for the church? Well, no. Still not in this culture, right? Is there ever a time where people are going to see tattoos and say, wow, that must be a really good Christian? Well, no. Still not in this culture, right? Is there ever a time where men are going to walk around with a bunch of earrings in their ears and you're going to see anything of virtue and distinction in that? No, not really, right? So there's so many layers to this. But the solution is not judgment, per se, unless it's this judgment. The solution is not, well, why does that guy have that? Why is he choosing that? Why is he wearing that? It's why are, not why is he, but why, but what's undergirding it? What's the reason? And so then, of course, we judge truthfully. Recognize that, if I've worked with a brother, he loves the Lord, I love the Lord, he loves the Word, I love the Word, and whether he finally comes to the point where he looks me dead in the eye and says, you know what, brother, you're right, this is probably not the best, but I'm doing it. And maybe one day I'll have maybe one day I'll stop, or I like it, or whatever it might be. Or, yeah, I know I could be spending my money in better ways, but I like this, and I have the money to do it, or whatever it might be. At that point you say, and this is the question that I've asked before, you look a man in the eye and say, can you honestly say before the Lord that when you stand before God and answer for this action, that you believe you can answer? And if the answer is yes, if he knows the scriptures, you know the scripture, you both love the Lord, and the answer is yes, he might be lying to you. You can't change, there's nothing you can do about that. But it's not your job to say, I think he's lying. I'm going to dig until I break him. That's not for you. You know what? Let God break him. If he's lying, that's between him and the Lord. And we need to allow people to make their own choices. God does. And we can stand and we can love and we can call and we can cry and we can help and we can be that voice and we can guide, but you can't make choices for people. And that's a bummer. From the standpoint of your own thinking, because, if you could just clone you, the world would be perfect, right? But, that's the way we think. But isn't that wonderful that we don't have to worry, that we don't have to be the arbiters of other people's free will? Isn't it great that I can just say, you know what? I've done my best. I love them. The bridge is not burnt. I'm here for them. Yep, I may have to distance myself from them a little bit because I don't want to be around that. And by the way, if we both love the Lord and we come to a mutual decision that he's doing, that he says he's doing what he's doing and he's okay, and I'm doing what I'm doing and I'm okay, then he will be okay with me saying, you know what, and I can't be around you when you're doing that, right? Yeah, I get it. I get it. And I'm good with it. And by the way, when I come your way, I'm not going to do that. And if he's right with the Lord, he will be there. Sarah.
One thing to always, keep in the core when you're judging someone is that it's the goodness of the Lord that leads us unto repentance. Yes, we have to do tough love, but it is God's goodness.
Yep.
That not his judgment, it's his goodness that
Right.
leads us to repentance.
Right. Yeah, it's the goodness of the Lord that leads to repentance. We don't tell people, let's put it this way, we don't tell people that they're doing wrong in order to compare ourselves, elevate ourselves, or anything of the sort. We do it out of love. But there is a point where our love can compel us to get out of balance too if we're not careful. Where we've got to just leave someone to the Lord. We've done our part. We've worked through the process. We've told them what we think. If we have to put barriers in place or distance or whatever it is, we put those things in place. But we do it all with and always to love them, not to punish them. Right? When someone's doing wrong, we don't separate from them so that we can punish them. Now, that being said, the scriptures do say, as it relates in 1 Corinthians, we'll get there, to the man who is fornicating with his mother-in-law, have no company with him that he may be ashamed. But that's still not a punishment. The idea is not, we are withholding from you our fellowship as a punishment for your actions. The idea is, look, we simply cannot be around you. If you want this fellowship, you've got to get right. And when you get right, we're ready to receive you. Right? Andrea? how much is that? So the question is, how much is that concept individual versus the body? I think that it's far more body than individual. That the ideas of censorship of that magnitude, the no fellowship censorship, the idea is significantly more weighty in the body, in the spiritual fellowship than it is, say, in your personal life. Now, again, if there are things that you can't be around, a person is openly sinning, yeah, there's a personal thing there. But if it's a person is making wrong choices, if they claim to be a believer, maybe you would have an individual censoring of someone, but I would say less so. And the reason why I say that is because the body we believe in the local church, which means local churches are the ones someone binds themselves to and they have authority under. They have not bound themselves to my authority. Even if I'm a family member, they have not bound themselves to my authority. And so I need to be careful the extent to which I say, because you're a believer and I'm a believer, I'm going to censor you in a believing sort of a way. It's really their church's responsibility to do that. And to have that church authority standing over them, because that's where the authority lies. The authority does not lie with me. The authority lies with the church. If there's a relationship issue, that's different. But that's a relationship issue more than it is a spiritual issue. And that is a hard one, but I would lean significantly more toward it's a corporate body decision in those sort of have no fellowship with. Formal. Decided with a path toward redemption, which is something that a church body can do that an individual really can't do as well. We'd have to dig more into that, though, and maybe we will when we get to this. This series is going to take forever. If it starts getting long in the tooth or unprofitable, do me a favor and just let me know. So far, as we've not been really, really focused, I feel like it's all been profitable and unto the right end. But if at some point you're like, Pastor, we're just in the weeds, getting lost, the wind's blowing us all over, let me know that you feel that way, please. And we can start to try to refocus. But that's a whole nother issue. But if Paul said, this is back to judgment, so we are getting back into that. He said, when I told you to come, when I told you to have no fellowship with sinners, I think he said fornicators, I did not say altogether the fornicators of this world, lest you come out of this world. But I said that if any man call himself a brother be a fornicator, with such an one know not to eat, right? And so there is a question as to how much of that would be individual versus corporate. But there is also the idea in Matthew chapter 18 that when a person has done wrong and you have one, you say your grievance, and then there's two, and then there's then you bring him before the church, and then you count him to be a publican and a sinner, right? And the idea of I count him to be a publican and a sinner is that I am going to put you on the level of, I'm going to assume that you're an unbeliever until you bear some fruit otherwise. And at the point that I assume someone is an unbeliever, well, if someone is living in open sin as an unbeliever, then the church is going to have natural prohibitions against fellowship with him. And I don't mean you can't but the idea being that person in a public setting, we might invite them to a dinner on the grounds or whatever, but they're not going to be a part of our fellowship, our spiritual fellowship. But I am going to interact with that person, because how can I win them if I don't interact with them? And so there are lines that will be drawn, spiritual lines that will be drawn, but those lines are significantly more an authority level than it is necessarily a relational level, because I've still got to have the ability to reach out to unbelievers. I can't just cloister myself against the unbeliever because they're unbelievers. And even a person that claims to be a believer, I will treat them as an unbeliever. I'm not going to bring them into brotherly fellowship. I'm not going to invite them to prayer meetings or Bible studies if they're for believers, per se. We would obviously bring an unbeliever who's searching, but not one who's not, right? But But I'm not going to usher them into spiritual fellowship of that sort, because that would be incongruent. Yeah, so that's a whole other issue there. Okay, we're way late. Joel?
I think this does stretch out more. I don't think, as long as you keep the reins, I don't think it would hurt anything, especially if decides to grow this church for us to remember and realize we become pretty comfortable with people who are here, especially some of us younger people growing up into a Christian realm, having proper judgment is a good thing.
Yep.
And being able to think through it and really talk over it, spend some time on it, I think is
Yeah, it's worth talking through to the point where you truly feel confident and comfortable in the method of righteous judgment. And it's worth talking through specifically because if you don't, then you won't. You'll either be frozen into not judging anything, no righteous judgments or unrighteous judgments, or you will become very comfortable in unrighteous judgment. And we want to find that line where we are exercising ourselves in grace and in love, fearfully, humbly, lovingly, truthfully, judging others in the right manner. And not just that we can know it, but we've got to help others understand this. Because it's not an easy thing to parse through. I mean, we spent 45 minutes on a cookie illustration, right? So there's a lot here, and it changes ever so slightly with every scenario, whether you're talking about smoking or drinking. And each one of us might actually put smoking or drinking or movies or modesty or decency, we might each put those on slightly different levels ourselves as to which ones are the ones that we really need to avoid that, or avoid them all, or only avoid a few of them, or whatever it might be. But if we're always coming at brothers and sisters in Christ with a spirit to build up and to edify, and if we are going to pursue that path, that direction, unto that end, with these ideas in mind, fearfully, humbly, lovingly, truthfully, we should be able to thread that needle very nicely. And what others do with it is going to be up to them, right? Are you going to be falsely accused of judging unrighteously when you judge righteously? You are. But if you're confident if you've gone through the steps and you're confident where you are, that's okay. Let them think what they will. Don't burn the bridge. Take a step back. Love them. Pray for them. If maybe you haven't done it right, maybe you've been trying to hit the upper level stuff, but you've not ever said, hey, okay, you say you're fine, you say you're doing nothing wrong. We ask the question, are you doing something right? They say, it doesn't matter, I'm not doing anything wrong. Well, maybe let's dig down and see what's going on underneath. Let's pop the hood of the car a little bit and see if there's something leaking under there, right? And figure out why it is that this person feels compelled to this action. And if you can help them, you can help them. If you can't help them, that doesn't mean there won't be grief, especially if it's someone close that you love. But, if you can't help them, they're making their decisions. You're not their judge, and you're also not their savior. Jesus is both of those. You've got to let him be both. We just do the best we can. Sam.
Kind of what you're saying there is also checking ourselves to say, am I approaching this person because I truly do love them, or because what they're doing?
Right. Yeah. Do I actually love this person, or am I annoyed by them, or am I offended? That's a big one, especially for someone that you've known for a long time, and they have gone back on something that you both have talked about or agreed upon or whatever. And not to say that you had agreement with each other, but you used to have conversations about how this is wrong or that is right, and now they're doing something else, and you're just offended. Well, I stuck to the stuff and they didn't. What went wrong with them? You know, maybe nothing went wrong with them. Maybe something went wrong with them. But there's only one way to know, and that's not by trying to change them, right? Yeah, so maybe it's, check your motives. Is it love? Is it love that compels you to build up a brother in Christ, or is it offense? Is it anger? Is it pride? Is it just surprise? Whatever. There's a lot of other things other than godly love and edification that can motivate our desire to see someone change. But the last thing that we want is for someone to change for our sake. You know, I don't want my children to grow up and say, I do what I do simply because it would disappoint my dad so much if I didn't, as it relates to spiritual things. Now, if it relates to some standard, okay. If that's their reason for holding to some standard, and they know that they don't have to, but they don't want to, whatever. But if, as far as it relates to spiritual things, the last thing I want is just, I only do what I do because I don't want to disappoint my church or my pastor or my father or my mother. Because I know I'm going to get the lecture, whatever it might be. And so they change for me. It makes my life easier, but does it bring them closer to Christ? And that doesn't mean that there's not that person, and when I say this, that doesn't mean there's not that person who you say, hey, you just need to stop doing this. And they stop doing it, and because they stopped doing it, it's like the sin cloud lifted, because they just, in faith, said, okay, pastor says I need to quit doing this thing, so I'm going to quit. And the sin cloud lifts, and it's like, now they can see and they get it. And so they commit their works unto the Lord, and then their thoughts are established, right? There's some biblical principle for you. Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. Not to say that that can't happen, where we start with the method or the action, and then the heart gets established later. And maybe and this is where we get back, Steve, to a little bit of what you were saying about children. One of the reasons why we set the standards we do in our children's lives is so that their hearts are pure enough to be able to receive with clarity the truth. Because if their hearts have been marred by sin, they may not be supple to the truth anymore. So while things may not be explicitly sinful, they are going to confuse, distract, or otherwise obscure the ability for the truth to hit hard or to hit with clarity. And so I'm going to keep those things back from them for those reasons, while simultaneously acknowledging that doesn't mean that the rest of your life you're never going to be able to touch these particular facets of life. It just means that for this particular time, these are things that are not going to be beneficial to your growth, development, spiritual maturity, innocence, whatever it might be. And there's just so much that goes into this, which is why this checklist is so helpful. It's not really a checklist, which is why these principles are so helpful. Because if I can't do it in that spirit, out of love, then I'm just going to not do it. And I'll pray and I'll wait, and maybe the Lord will open up that opportunity. Maybe He'll place that love upon my heart. Maybe He will place the burden upon my heart. Maybe there will be a clarity of what's actually going on. Maybe the burden actually needs to be, you know what? Spend time getting to know this person. Dig in with them, and maybe the issues will actually bubble up themselves. I'm not even going to have to confront, because once I know this person well enough, they're going to say, you know what, I'm struggling with this sin and it's bothering me, and it may come out. And yeah, you've seen that sin for months now, but you weren't quite ready yet to, with clarity, judge fearfully, humbly, lovingly, and truthfully. So you're just going to keep your mouth shut until you can. And when the opportunity arises, then you do. Andrea.
That's a helpful point, because God actually might be prompting someone else to do it also. Like you said, with the man that gets saved.
Yeah.
He may be asking you to do one thing with that person and someone else to do it harder.
Yeah, maybe God's chosen you to be the good cop, not the bad cop this time, right? And that's possible too, which is why, again, none of this, we don't want any of this to freeze us into inaction. And then various people, their character is such that, you've got the the weeping prophet types, and they're just going to tell you every time, right? Whereas others will have a different method, and there's room for that too. There's room for certain people that have the gifting and the calling unto an end. But this is where we trust the Lord. We walk down the path. If we feel compelled that we have to, I need to talk to this person. I need to confront this person. I need to deal with this. Okay, make sure you're dealing with it right. And if you're right with the Lord, and you're burdened to do it, then do it without shame. Do it without fear. Do it with a heart of love to understand, to help, to edify, to build up, and then leave the results to the Lord. And if we as a church can be this, if we as families can be this, then not only will there be benefit in it of itself, but wouldn't it be wonderful? And we see this in broader society, but I think it's in the church as well. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually come up and have conversations about deficiencies without feeling attacked? That a brother can sit you down and say, you know what? I've seen things. I'm concerned about them. Maybe they're a problem. Maybe they're not. But I just need to lay it out there. What's your motivation? Are you missing something? Do you have a blind spot? And if every time someone does that to me, I have to defend myself. If I have to defend myself, if I feel attacked, then people are going to stop. Unless we have this kind of confidence. And then we can keep going. And then when someone does feel attacked, then you can say, well, whoa, wait a minute. Why do you feel attacked? I do this with my children when I discipline them. And if at the end of the discipline they're angry, I ask them, why are you angry? Because now we get down to the question mark of, well, if you're angry, then you didn't receive what I just gave you in the spirit that I gave it. Because what I did is I just helped you and brought restoration of fellowship between you and Daddy. So that's a wonderful thing. Now, I understand you don't like what happened, but I didn't choose that. So, you certainly don't be angry at me for being a faithful father and a loving father. And that kind of an attitude and that kind of a spirit into what we would call judgment is what we want to have with one another, both ways. And what a wonderful thing if our church could be that, and if our children could be that, and if we could raise that, and we could cultivate that, where we can make each other better without getting upset or alienated. And we could seek to make each other better for the right reasons. Out of love, not offense, not frustration, not those things, not selfishness or pride, but out of love. I want to make you better, and I think that this can make you better. Good. We'll stop there. And next week we will move on. I wanted to do the cookie thing, but next week we'll move into the other passages and we'll start walking through them. We've laid enough foundation that the rest of these, until we get to the weaker brethren stuff, will probably flow pretty nicely. We'll just talk through what we see, how to apply the principles that we've learned. And then when we get to the weaker brethren and the liberty stuff, we might have a little bit more talking to do about those things. But I think we're setting a really good foundation, a mindset with which to interpret what we'll be reading.
Thank you for listening to Pastor Jamen Wikler from Legacy Baptist Church in Buffalo, Minnesota. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.